Hello, my name is Aldrin, and I'm a founding engineer at Bauplan, and I'll be presenting Let AI Build Your Pipelines Without Breaking Your Heart or Production. So, this is the last day in the Data Valentine challenge hosted by Reki, and I'll be talking about, letting AI build data pipelines using Bauplan, and then how you can, change the workflow it has to follow Write-Audit-Publish or WAP workflow. So, using Bauplan's transactional branches to protect the data quality in your lakehouse. So again, my name is Aldrin and founding engineer. I'm also currently a PhD candidate and hope at UC Santa Cruz and hoping to finish soon. But I have just a few slides and then I'm gonna go through a demo, for the scenario. And so on the left here, I kind of highlight a case study between Intella and Bauplan. And what the reason for highlighting this case study is it's going to serve as the reference workflow and reference data pipeline for what is it what we're going to build in the repository for the demo. And so Intella, actually I'll talk about it a bit later, but in the reference data pipeline, they have a few steps for like how do they transform the data to validate it and make sure that it's all correct. And their workflow is a type of like medallion architecture, right? But they only have a bronze layer and a silver layer, at least for like what they're using Bauplan for. And in the repository for the demo, I have just a few things. And the idea is that the demo is going to be entirely run by an AI agent. So there's a README for people. So that'll describe the overview or like the overall like scenario, like what the demo is. There's a Claude file for agents, and I'll be using Claude Code. And then I have a directory where I have skill-like, descriptions, right? So it's really meant to be a narrative across 3 steps, and each one will kind of describe like, what the intention is, like what the goal of that step is, and then also a task list for an AI agent. So I'll go through those individually, but here in the slide deck, I've included links to all the appropriate files and the repository so that it's easy to find. Now, talk about the lakehouse architecture a bit before we do the demo, and then this is the last thing before the demo. So on the left here, I describe a bit about Bauplan's control plane and data plane, and then on the right, I talk about like what the actual storage is for the lakehouse. And then the diagram in the bottom is the overall workflow. So as far as storage goes, Bauplan uses Iceberg on top of S3. So you'll see on the left here, there are some data sources that come from S3. And then, on the right, like we have kind of the gold layer, right? But, usually gold layer is just some subset of the tables, but ultimately the lakehouse is entirely stored in Iceberg. And then the Iceberg catalog we use provides a git-for-data backend, right? And so here you'll see that there's like a main branch, and that's shown by the thicker line. And then we have this other branch, which we call a staging branch for this demo, where all the other work is done, right? And when we merge this branch into the main branch, what happens is any tables that were in the bronze and silver that were new, right? You think like merge on copy on write, right? So like anything that's updated will get updated in the main catalog, and then anything that wasn't updated, like there's just no changes. And then going back to the control and compute side, so there's a client, right? And this is how we're going to interact. Either developers or AI agents will interact with Bauplan. So this will use either a CLI or a Python SDK. The actual data pipeline itself can be written using Python code or SQL, and that's all like within like a Bauplan. There's like a framework for how you might write a data pipeline, and we'll just see more of that in the demo. But ultimately, to kind of look at this diagram a bit more, right? Doing the data import, creating the staging branch, merging, right? These are all actions that are kind of on the lakehouse itself. And so this will be kind of what we might call an outer loop, right? Or, just lakehouse like workflow. And then, whatever tables we have in the bronze layer, whatever tables we have in the silver layer, right? So bronze layer containing raw data that's, mostly untransformed, maybe with some minimal validations. And then the silver layer containing like actual like curated validated data from the bronze, right? So we'll have some tables in both of these layers, and then this ingestion pipeline is an actual data pipeline that like will be run, and like this pipeline is considered, the inner loop, right? So what are the actual functions that are being run to like select from one table or many tables into other tables? And then this validation, this pipeline will kind of represent like the second step in the overall narrative, which is really about what's the problem that this scenario poses, right? And so overall, this will be the workflow for the data challenge. So we'll go ahead and switch to the demo. This is the case study repository, but first we will look at the demo repository. So I wanted to do this as much from scratch as possible. So demos. So here we will, obviously I practiced this before, but here we'll have the repository that we want to clone for the demo. We'll just clone it here. And then we will go into this directory. And then I'll almost certainly lose this terminal, but open local folder. And there should be not that one. I think it'll be in demos. And then here. So we'll open this. Yep. Lost the terminal as expected. And then we'll go there again. Okay. So a little easier to see on the right, because I can make this bigger, not that. There's one directory called narration. So in here, we have kind of like the steps of the demo. And so if I go here and I open this, what? So you'll see that there's like an overview of like what, this step does. There's some prerequisites. This is the task list for the agent. And then, at the end, there's kind of like general information for like understanding what are bronze and silver layers, what are the bronze and silver layers in this demo, like how can you run it, and this is meant to be, obviously the task list is for the agent, but everything else is meant to be for developers or agents. And then, there are a couple other things here. So I will go through those after I start up our AI agent. And the way I've set this up is I can just say, start the story, and it should go through and start to look at, what it's, what the demo describes, and then like what are all the various steps. So I will first look at the Claude file, right? And so here, I set Claude up to say like, how do you use this challenge? Like, how do you run the challenge? What are some things, like some guardrails, some like boundaries that I set for it to like fall into. Near the bottom here, I have some information about Bauplan integration. So this will point at like, here's some information about like Bauplan, where can you find CLI, where can Claude find CLI information or SDK information? So here it's asking me, and I say, yes, you can fetch that. Right. And then if we look at the README, just, for context. So here I try to say like, what is the information that like was for the webinar itself, but then also like what's a more detailed overview for like what we're going to do in the demo. And part of the intention here is that, even if you don't want to use an AI agent, like there should be enough information here, but also for the AI agent itself, this should be enough for it to bootstrap and kind of like, as it goes through the task list, it has a little bit more context on like what are the things it should be doing, what is the end goal, like how do I make sure it's not doing too much at an earlier step, all of that sort of information. Do that, and so at the bottom of the README, I say, here's something you can say to like get started. but I also pretty sure I said somewhere that as long as there's something talking about start, like this is what should be happening. Yeah. And so one thing that the agent has tried to do is like, run Bauplan CLI. And like my particular system, I don't have it installed globally. So I've told it to use UVX. And then I also told it that if the default profile isn't set up, because I personally don't use one, fall back on this lake agent profile. So what the agent's going to do is it's going to use a mix of the CLI and the SDK to do the various lakehouse things. So the purpose of using the CLI is for it to actually, more directly get interact with Bauplan so that it can kind of see like, where are things going wrong, right? Like, it can check the state, it can triage and like debug a little bit more directly. But then the point of using the SDK is like, how would it build like the overall lakehouse workflow that like, a developer would want, right? Like how do how might you run this in production? And then as it runs, so it has created this lakehouse workflow directory. So there's not much in the init except for a description. It has this script, right? So here it's talking about import bronze telemetry, right? It does like, here's all the S3 information, and then what it's going to do is it's going to do the import data step, right? So the way this is set up is that everything in the lakehouse workflow directory should be kind of like considered the outer loop, right? Like interacting with the lakehouse itself, setting up the branches, like, based on what happens in a data pipeline, do you merge, do you not? And you can imagine that this particular directory might be either replaced or extended to use like an actual orchestration framework like Orchestra or Prefect, but just for the purposes of this demo, like, just writing some Python scripts using the Bauplan SDK, right? So the idea is that, Bauplan doesn't require that you use it directly for orchestration, but if you don't have an orchestration framework, then, you should still be able to use Bauplan, right? So it is, the other thing I should do the next time it asks me to do something. Come on, here we go. That looks good, but also can you display the task list after every step? Right. So what it's about to do is it's about to write like a commit branch script. So, this is a script that it'll run whenever it runs a data pipeline, and then, it can merge the branch that data pipeline was run on, or, it doesn't commit it. And so something that like, transactional branches offer, right, is that the AI agent can do all of its work on a branch. And of course, every data pipeline needs to run on a branch, right? And for this demo, I'm having the AI agent actually merge or not merge directly into main. And like that's not, maybe something you'd always want to do. Maybe it's something you can do if like you're really confident in like the AI workflow you have set up. But if you're not that confident, or if you like really want to validate everything that the AI has done before you like publish the data like to the main branch of your lakehouse, then you can actually have the AI agent run on like a totally separate branch, a lake agent branch or whatever, and it can work entirely in that branch. And then whenever you decide manually or programmatically that that branch is actually like ready to be published to the main branch of the lakehouse, then you can actually merge that branch. And so at the moment, the agent is having issues with executing the workflow. Oh, it's like a pi arrow compatibility issue, probably because 3.11 maybe. I'm not entirely sure. But anyways, and then this run, it's using an environment variable, and that's just to make it like a little bit easier to see what things might you parameterize. And then it's running this lakehouse workflow, right? So if we look at the lakehouse workflow, there's like a main Python script. And so this kind of shows the overall workflow that you might do, right? So the first phase is import the telemetry. And so I meant to talk about this earlier, but I'll talk about it in a bit. So this is like the data that we're importing into the lakehouse. This will be imported into the bronze layer. There's an ingestion pipeline. So this ingestion pipeline is, the actual data pipeline. At the moment, it's in the directory called challenge pipeline. We can look at that soon. And then commit branch, right? And so commit branch will have the logic of like, do you do it? Do you not? Table ls. So, right. One thing that I glossed over that I didn't want to gloss over was in the README, I also talk about like in the scenario, imagine that you're developing software that looks for data anomalies, right? And so this is the use case for Intella, right? And so what Intella does is they develop software that looks for anomalies in sensor data of satellite fleets. So they're meant to help satellite operators manage a large fleet of satellites. So, again, when we talk about like this import telemetry, right, this is specifically talking about satellite telemetry, which is essentially like health data, sensor data, like anything that sensors might capture. The other thing is we can look at the pipeline itself, right? And so in this first step, we purposely have it be a very simple pipeline. And so all it does is, select from the bronze layer and then directly into the silver layer. And the silver layer is just the signal table. And this Python function being named signal is recognized as like data that will be the signal table. And so it just returning here. Let's check back in on the AI agent. Namespace doesn't exist in the SDK. That doesn't seem correct. So let's see. Namespace is definitely a decorator in the Bauplan library. Are you sure you imported Bauplan? And also you can check, so the Bauplan playbook won't describe this, but certainly what would talk about it is the new pipeline. The new pipeline skill to see what you may have missed. So, of course, AI agents hallucinate a lot or, miss a lot of instructions that they've been given. So I find that if I run with it interactively, it's a lot less prone to that. I've done a couple practice runs where I just let it run and it does interesting things, to say the least. Okay. So it is getting a Bauplan reference again, even though it already has it downloaded. So that's interesting. I guess it just, yeah. Try both approaches. Well, so for the purposes of this demo, this is okay, but ordinarily I wouldn't set the namespace in the project configuration. Oh, I see. When I said that it definitely has a namespace, I forgot that I was looking at a file that was already updating. So it does not have a namespace decorator. And so let's see if there's anything else of interest while it runs that. So another thing I've added is there's a troubleshooting file. So the main thing that I've included here is kind of like the difference between like, if you happen to have an MCP server set up, it's not necessarily as encouraged as using skills now, but if you have it set up, then that MCP server will be set up with a particular API key, right? And it could differ from what's used with the CLI commands or the SDK because, every time a CLI command is run, you can change which API key it uses, right? So, the troubleshooting file just kind of describes like, hey, here's some gotchas that you might hit. So if you do, hopefully this will be useful. Uh, yeah. Stage manager is deleted. Okay, good. So it's in this executing naive workflow step. It's doing all of these checks manually. Ordinarily, you might want, your minimal validation to be actually like programmatic, like in code. That way you can version it. But for the demo, like this is okay. So, it summarizes all these things in the task list it's completed, right? And if we look here, for instance, create workflow executor. So that's probably, create workflow executor, right? So all these things should be done. Um, and then it should summarize with like, here's a naive implementation, it ingests data, but it lacks proper quality checks, right? So like this is where we should find ourselves in the story, right? And so, if you just say like continue to the next, I call them narrative iterations just because it's like not exactly chapters, but it is like the next step in the narrative, So, and then what should happen, and we can close a few of these. Well, what should happen now, right, is the agent is going to create this validation pipeline like workflow. And part of this is going to be like, hey, create a data validation pipeline, right? So the data validation pipeline will read from like the tables. It will do some validation like actually in, data pipeline functions, right? So, I even tell the agent like use this skill, right? So this is a pre-defined skill, like a standard skill that Bauplan provides, and that'll be in the LLM resource repository. I say, hey, prefer this when you're writing the pipeline functions, but the idea is that this is going to be running in the pipeline. So, in this step, we're creating this pipeline as like a separate thing to be run. But in the third step, when we're like kind of improving the overall workflow to be from kind of naive to a WAP workflow, what's actually going to happen is we're going to take this validation, we're going to put it in the ingestion pipeline, right? So that when data is imported into the bronze layer, that ingestion pipeline will actually also run validations. And so, whatever is in the silver layer will actually be okay. And then, overall, it should be a little bit more performant, or at least a little bit fewer like round trips, between the developer agent and the lakehouse. Yeah. And so, one of the things the agent should be recognizing because of the minimal validation we did in the previous step is that value is a string type. It's not actually like a double, but it holds doubles, right? So, you know, in this step, all we want the agent to do is write a pipeline that recognizes these errors. And then the next step will be, when we make it a WAP workflow, that's where that'll be addressed. Yeah, see, it actually tried to write directly to main. No, what happens is when it wrote this data pipeline, it didn't write it to like run against a branch other than main. And so something that Bauplan enforces is that like even if the pipeline itself doesn't write data, it can't be run directly against main unless you give it a dry run option, right? So with dry run, like, we don't have to validate that your code won't write any data. We know that we won't write any data. And so the dry run option is kind of allowed to run directly on main, but it's not actually going to do anything, right? So that's not going to be that useful for the purposes of this step in the demo. And so, we have the AI agent like, you know, go ahead and create a branch to run this data pipeline. And then, it can merge the branch or it can just delete the branch. It doesn't matter because, no data will be written. Yeah. And so another thing is that using the CLI, the AI agent's able to look at logs for a specific job, right? And so like when you launch a data pipeline, that whole launch is considered a job. And so you can get the logs for that job. For now, job logs are available for 24 hours. Right. And then, so the validation pipeline was created, and like this is mostly themed language, like, oh, like the anomaly detection is degrading, because like we're allowing bad data, right? So, at this point, we've said like, oh, hey, like this is something that failed, right? So this is something we should address in the next, in like the solution, right? So continue to the next narrative iteration. So if we look at the next one, so this is the overview, and like, I thought this is kind of cute, healthy commitment. But anyways, so the idea is like now we're going to add validation to the data pipeline. So it's one thing to have a pipeline that, does certain things, right? And then run validation afterwards. But it would be much more efficient, to actually run the validation in the data pipeline, because then it can like take advantage of like caching effects. It can also, well, I mean, I suppose like that's the main benefit to like putting it directly in, because other benefits you might see, like we already get from the transactional branches or the Git-like branches, right? If you want to inspect the data at a later time, or if you want to inspect the data, from someone else's branch, as long as you have access, then, you can do that. So yeah. But I guess going back to the validations being run, so there's these three key validations. And then if we look at the validations that it ran before, scroll me. If we look at the validations it ran before, when identifying the problems, so it said that there were no null values. It said that like all the value column were numeric. Like I think, because it says float64 compatible, they may be strings, but they're compatible with numbers. So in this case, the uniqueness validation is the only one that's kind of being violated. Yeah, and then once those validations are added, then we'll update the workflow to like actually like make sure that the validation passes before we do the merge. And because I don't know what the agent actually implemented for, the merge commit or the commit, what did it call that script? Commit branch. For the commit branch script, like I don't know if it, there's going to be that much update to this portion, or if this is, a pretty minimal change. Right. And the other thing is, at the moment for the demo, because the data is not that big, the materialization strategy is set to replace. So what's going to happen is when we update, when the AI agent updates the swap the workflow to follow a WAP workflow, the silver table or the silver layer in the branch will have correct data, and replace materialization will actually replace that data. And then when the merge happens, like that table will then actually like replace whatever table was in main. And some of that will be mostly done by like the way Iceberg manages metadata, right? And like kind of like using snapshots. But if you don't want to do a replace, like I may have said before, there are multiple materialization strategies. So you can do like append, and then there's also like partition based appending. There are other options. But in this case, the reason I say all this is when the AI agent finishes running this new WAP workflow, it'll say, hey, all the data passes. And like, that's, what it will have done, right? It will have replaced all of the data before. And now it's still, so pipeline succeeded with data cleaning, right? So here's kind of like a summary it's giving. It's saying, when we did the initial setup, the data quality like had some corruptions. Now it's clean, but the main thing being, so like now there's, less than half the rows because, now we don't have any duplicate rows, right? So this is, just a summary that the AI agent's going to give you. But something we can look at, right, is now if we look at the models here, right? So previously, this was just a simple like return the data you get. Look at this. So even though in the task list I said prefer PyArrow or Data Fusion, it still wanted to use pandas. So sometimes like when you're giving the instructions for your AI agent, it seems like it's better for you to explicitly say things like, don't use pandas rather than just encouraging other libraries. And the thing with, because Bauplan uses Arrow, so the thing with Arrow data to pandas data frames is like, it's just not as efficient. But that being said, you can see kind of like how the AI agent has implemented this function, right? And like we only need this one function to go from the bronze layer to the silver layer. So it's good, right? This is now a data pipeline that does, the cleaning. The validation checks are done as what Bauplan calls expectations, right? So this function will go through and say like, is this data numeric, right? And this can be reusable, as a like with other things, with other Python functions or models. So here, the expectation actually says like what model to use. But this, if this implementation is moved into a different function, that's how it could be reusable. But in the expectation, the AI agent did manage to use PyArrow. So that's interesting. But yeah, so these expectations all run, and assuming that they all pass, like that's when the merging is done. So if we look at what commit branch does, so it knows what the silver tables are, and it runs. So double checks that the silver tables exist. It does some queries. Yeah, and then I guess the query is basically just that it's non-zero. So the actual merging basically just makes sure that like it has values, right? And then it relies, with the changes in the, the addition of the expectations, right? We expect that like, anything that would fail, like those types of validations just won't be in the silver table, right? So that's kind of like how they connect and they integrate. And that's it. Yeah. So, hopefully that was, learned a lot. It's kind of, using the LLM is not always that fast, but I didn't have to do any programming myself, right? So, and then like this last slide, I just kind of, explicitly mentioned some of the references, right? So this Bauplan LLM resources is the repository where I got, the predefined skills. And then also there's a couple markdown files for the Bauplan reference, and then just a little bit more information about like what's in the Claude, what's in README. Yeah, and that's it. Like here's again the repository URLs, and that's it, done. So thank you for attending.